The way we're going, it's going to be 6 degrees centigrade hotter. There's no evidence that anyone is doing a thing about it.
This is the world's foremost anti-nuclear campaigner.
There is no way you can justify nuclear power. None.
Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Parts of Tokyo are extremely radioactive. Nuclear power produces massive quantities of global warming gas. There are wild boar in Germany that almost glow in the dark. But 40% of the food probably in Europe is radioactive. More people have died from Chernobyl than in the Black Plague. Then we extrapolate through to Japan. Japan is by orders of magnitude many times worse than Chernobyl. Yet people like George Monbiot, who write for The Guardian, attack me full frontal, saying I don't know what I'm talking about. How dare anyone question our medical credential? I don't say things that are inaccurate, otherwise I would be deregistered. I mean, doctors can't lie. The doctors have been told by the superiors not to tell patients that their symptoms are related to radiation. This is the biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George.
I don't think you could dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry. I don't think you can dismiss the very large amount of data on the... Sorry, you're saying you would dismiss the UN Scientific Committee as being part of the nuclear industry?
Yes, let me tell you, George.
Wow. Then the mind boggles. Where does this end?
The mind does boggle.
Them and the UN Scientific Committee and the IAEA and... I mean, who else is involved in this conspiracy? We need to know.
A lot of my liberal friends say, all right, global warming is real. That means that we have to hold our nose and go for nuclear power.
In the suite of options that I was looking at, being renewable energies, energy efficiencies and carbon offsetting, without some extra major additional force to come in and help the effort, these solutions were not going to so much as touch the sides of meeting this problem. I needed to come back and look at an option that I hadn't permitted myself to see up to that point, which was nuclear power.
That is absolutely essential. What's your response to that?
So why are your Liberal friends so ignorant? Well, they haven't read my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer.
That's right.
And the first chapter deals with the fact that nuclear power produces a substantial amount of global warming gas.
Nuclear power produces massive quantities of global warming gas because you have to mine millions of tons of earth to extract the uranium.
In fact, a nuclear power plant will produce the same amount of CO2 in toto as a gas-fired plant, so you may as well just use gas.
I found out, first of all, that it is a zero-carbon power source, at least to the exact same extent that we regard renewable energy sources as a zero-carbon power source. This has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated. I thought the opposite. I was wrong. The idea that nuclear power is high carbon across the life cycle is a false meme.
Forget about all the data and the figures and stuff. Listen to your intuition and you'll know what you've got to do.
She's been featured by CNN, The New York Times, CBC, Democracy Now!, 60 Minutes, and C-SPAN.
I'm testifying at your Darlington hearing soon. What am I going to say? You're all fools. What do you think you're doing? I mean, you all need psychoanalysis.
Primetime television audiences would be better served if her appearances included a quick montage of statements she's made to her supporters.
Why even make our children clean their teeth and have immunisations and have a good education when clearly they have no future, and they don't? Everything else you do is unimportant, except to close down all the reactors and to make the governments put solar panels on every single building in America, in Europe, in England, in Australia, in Russia, all over the world, and just cover the place with windmills. It's what we've got to do if we want to keep using electricity. Otherwise, we have to stop using electricity. And think about it. Mozart wrote by candlelight, and so did Shakespeare. So the human race has lived for a very long time without electricity.
Before we examine Caldicott's statements regarding nuclear power, let's look at energy itself.
Anything that reduces the population is actually a positive, and life is sacred. But when you got 6 billion people, it's pretty common. It's not as sacred as it once was.
I totally agree about overpopulation. In the year 1800, there were 1 billion of us. Now there are 6.5 billion.
Nations with the most births per woman are really the poorest ones. Prosperity depends strongly on electric power for cooling, for heating, for water purification, for industry, for transportation. All those things depend upon electric power.
Prosperity is needed to slow population growth. Energy is needed for prosperity.
If you gave me only one wish, I can pick who's president, I can pick a vaccine, which is something I love, or having energy be a quarter as expensive and environmentally friendly, I'd pick the energy. In fact, if you could pick just one thing to lower the price of, to reduce poverty, by far you would pick energy.
The only way that we're going to keep our global civilization going is to come up with enough energy to power it. And if you think that we have problems now, you don't know what problems are like until we don't have the energy to run the machinery of civilization.
We simply cannot live with this kind of population at the technology state we had 200 years ago that the developing world is still at. The notion that the answer to our energy woes is for us all to revert to an agrarian lifestyle would doom roughly 85% of the planet to death.
They need to go back and look at what happened during the Depression, when people had to scavenge food from the natural environment and human beings way outpaced our normal carrying capacity. We've nearly rendered multiple species extinct so we could feed ourselves and our family.
Energy and pollution are not the same thing, but by ignoring nuclear, Caldicott is forced to prescribe a future of energy poverty.
If we move to renewables in a big way, but you would not be able to have the kind of power that we have now.
Oh, yes, you would.
I do think that we'd have to.
Yes, you would.
I commissioned a report in America called Carbon Free, Nuclear Free. It's a study that I set up by a brilliant physicist called Arjun Makajani. By 2030, America could have all the energy it needs from solar, from wind, from geothermal, from conservation.
With me tonight, I have Dr. Arjun Makajani.
You pay a lot more for electricity than we do today if we're simply going to generate electricity from new sources with low CO2 output. But if you do efficiency, you can come out at approximately the same cost as today for energy services. So that's how you do it.
Nobody's more into efficiency than a bunch of engineers. Efficiency is an engineer's favorite word. So to say efficiency is important, absolutely. Efficiency should always be pursued for its own value in every endeavor you do, whether it's how you get around or anything. But generation is something you always are going to have to. You're going to have to generate power.
In some realms, heating buildings, particularly new design buildings, and lighting, some air conditioning things, there's amazing efficiency stuff that can be done. Lighting's the killer because you're mostly making heat with today's light bulbs. And unfortunately, it's a fairly small part of the energy equation. Well, there's a lot of energy consumption, like the way we make fertilizer today. It's an unbelievably optimized process. Can we, by increasing efficiency, deal with our climate problem? The answer there is basically no, because the climate problem requires more than a 90% reduction in CO2 emitted. Every year we're improving our efficiency, enough poor people are increasing their energy intensity. You're not ever going to get the amount of CO2 emitted to go down unless you deal with the one magic factor, which is CO2 per kilowatt hour. You have to get it on the generation side because the growth in demand will match efficiency.
There were some Eskimos, Inuits, and they had their normal life and they dried their fish and plaited the leather and hunted the polar bears and lived in their igloos. And then they got electricity. And then they got television. And then the young men and women left to go to a better life. And their life was destroyed. That's what I'm talking about. I was in China in '88. There wasn't a single car. There were millions of bicycles. There was one tall building in Beijing. And I said, if China goes the way of America and they all get refrigerators and cars, we've had it.
There are people who are really using very, very little material and very, very little energy. They are so green, and they are so eager to stop being that kind of green. And the main economic and demographic event in the world now is people are getting the hell out of poverty. Wires everywhere because they need electricity to do all the stuff that means being part of a city.
How can I change this distribution so that most of this energy is being generated by non-carbon emitting sources? And then furthermore, how can I grow the pie itself so that other people in the world can enjoy energy at something a whole lot closer to a Western lifestyle? Because most of the world, especially the developing world, would love to have these things. And frankly, I think we should want them to have these things.
People always talk about China's consumption of energy and the emission of the CO2 as the largest quantity of the world. China export. The consumption of the energy in China is not totally for China, but for the world. But in US, not only per capita wise the highest energy consumption country, but also take advantage of other countries to make import of the goods, energy consumed in other countries rather than in the US. A lot of the energy used here in China is not for consume, it's for production.
A lot of energy consumption. It's an unbelievably optimized process where there's not the same room for improvement, which is largely industrial processes.
This is a 200-ton electric arc furnace. The main power source for the furnace is electricity. And so each furnace at max power is about 105 megawatt. We load scrap into large haul trucks and they back up into this bucket and dump scrap inside. That's dozens of cars. Yeah, a lot of cars. So that bucket probably has 140 tons of scrap in it right now. We also use pig iron from a blast furnace, appliances, we chop up old rail cars, demolish bridges, buildings, whatever.
I told them if they saw anything go boom to run behind you. Yeah. That's still the standard protocol.
That's right. I got Kevlar on.
All right, you guys do the same. We're all getting behind you.
This is a recycling facility. An electric arc furnace turns scrap metal into a steel alloy for use in automobiles, consumer products, and infrastructure such as pipes and bridges. This is a sorting facility. Sorting activities might be the first thing we think of when we hear the word recycle. In developed nations, sorting facilities offer full-time employment. In developing nations, people live on landfills and sell their personally sorted garbage for income. We all sort garbage to some extent, even if it is just to put refundables aside for bottle drives. Sorting is labor-intensive. Recycling is energy-intensive.
So you've been able to drop your power consumption per ton almost about a third, it looks like.
Probably since the mid-early 80s.
So besides your scrap material input, what's your next largest cost on production?
Electricity.
Electricity.
In a week's time, if both fires are run, we'll probably use more electricity than the city of Decatur will use in a year.
Yep. Wow.
In fact, one of the things that we've been chasing is, we've got all this waste heat, but it's the nature of it that doesn't lend itself very well to, throwing in a conventional Rankine cycle somewhere. In theory, back of the napkin kind of stuff, maybe we could recover another 20 or 30 megawatts out of the 200 we're sharing between these two furnaces. So as we probably captured 90% of what's to be captured, chasing the last 10% is pretty expensive. Most people don't understand. Everything you look at, touch, feel, anything that's tangible, there's energy behind it. A lot of it. I mean, you got the same people that demand fresh fish be flown in from Alaska and cold storage. They're the ones that, we got to have wind power. We got to have all these options that aren't viable. So, yeah, it's a frustration we felt in this industry.
Of your water use,
we're evaporatively cooling, and we use about 2.5 million gallons a day, so we're a pretty big water user, which is about 1/10 of what the paper mills use.
But you can get far more cycles on recycling steel or aluminum than you could out of paper or plastic.
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, it's debatable whether paper recycling is even that great a pursuit. In some cases, it's mandated, but this is one where economics drives the recycling.
But the steel industry is probably one of the better models of recycling.
Aluminum, too, would be. There's less given over to waste.
If we could make energy cheap enough, there's a lot of other products you could make economic to recycle.
Absolutely.
We saw the other day how electrical power was used to make steel from recycled materials. You know, those operations couldn't proceed if they thought in 2 hours they might or might not have power. They would not be able to make steel that way. They have to have reliable energy sources.
The steel industry is probably one of the better models of recycling.
Aluminum, too, would be. There's less given over to waste.
To smelt aluminum or to make aluminum, it requires huge amounts of energy. We've got to stop using aluminium cans. That's just crazy. And all this frozen food is just obscene too. We shouldn't be freezing food. When I was a kid, there was no frozen food. We did all right. You know, in the winter, it's so hot inside, you have to strip. The thermostat should be lowered. Why don't you hang your clothes outside in the sun to dry using the nuclear reactor in the sky? Every time you walk into one of those doors and it goes in front of you, that's powered by electricity.
Trust me, with a name like Kirk,
you can't help but think about Star Trek. It's a very positive view of the future. Are they running Star Trek on coal?
Is it running on wind and solar? I don't think so. It's running on nuclear energy.
It has been responsible for, I think, a lot of technological innovation that we are, in fact, enjoying in our lives today. The flip cell phone, that's Kirk's communicator. The Bluetooth earpiece, that Lieutenant Uhuru wore that. The iPad, we carried pads in the next generation on our version of the Enterprise. The way Geordie sees Google Glass, it's an important first step.
The last 2 chapters of this book are very exciting because they give you the prescription for survival.
Read my book, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer.
If I was going to try to be living on the moon or Mars, I would definitely want a nuclear power source. I would consider anything less to be tantamount to suicide.
Now, I spent 10 years working at NASA. This is the kind of community I was thinking of. It had all of the same needs as a community on Earth would have, but it had some very unique constraints. There's no coal on the moon. There's no petroleum. There's no natural gas. There's no wind either. And solar power had a real problem. The moon orbits the Earth once a month. For 2 weeks, the sun goes down and your solar panels don't make any energy. So nuclear energy was really the only choice. Thorium is a naturally occurring nuclear fuel that is 4 times more common in the Earth's crust than uranium. Thorium is also common on the moon and easy to find. It's so energy dense that you can hold a lifetime supply of thorium energy in the palm of your hand. If it was such a great thing for a community on the moon, why not a community on the Earth? The same energy generation and recycling techniques that can have a powerful impact on surviving on the moon could also have a powerful impact on surviving on the Earth.
There's no chance that we're going to reduce the human impact by trying to make everybody a lot poorer. We think of coal now as sort of the enemy of the environment #1, but coal allowed us to stop chopping down forests and using wood as fuel. And coal allowed massive global reforestation.
We look at areas around cities where cities have grown and they've cut down the trees, and yeah, sure enough, those are definitely less forested, but the United States is more heavily forested now than it was 100 years ago. Most people don't believe that, but it's true. The United States actually has more forest now than then. There's a lot of places that used to be agricultural 100 years ago that are forests now.
You can't have sustainable growth on a finite planet with finite resources, because it has to end when you use up all the resources.
The coexistence of high-density urbanization and unspoiled nature is not science fiction. This is what developed nations already do when they have access to high-density sources of energy. Developed nations grow their population due to immigration, not high birth rates. Developed nations endanger wildlands due to accidents from fossil fuel extraction, not suburban sprawl. Energy plus seawater gives us an infinite supply of fresh water. which will return to the ocean after being used to grow crops. Energy plus waste material gives us recycled materials for the next generation of infrastructure and consumer goods. This is hardly a new concept. The creation of Star Trek predates the moon landing.
Greetings, Captain.
1,200 points of interest in Yosemite, and you pick me.
We would stop going into high-risk areas where extracting oil is environmentally hazardous. We would stop blowing tops off of mountains. And there's all kinds of things we'd stop doing.
Nuclear provides the promise of actually being able to reduce the human impact even further through technology.
And all of it's driven, ironically, by a lot more energy consumption. And this is where I have a differing opinion than I think a lot of environmentalists. They're always trying to drive us towards using less energy because all that energy is coming from the consumption of fossil fuel.
We shouldn't have escalators. People must not be lazy. Americans should not feel they're entitled to use as much energy as they want.
Well, let's say your energy is not coming from the consumption of fossil fuel. If there was a lot of it and it was not harmful to the environment, what would you do that you're not doing now?
Give me a martini straight up with 2 olives for the vitamins.
Adults can get nice hands made that will work for their whole lives.
Printing a robo-hand is quick and cheap, which is important for children who can grow out of their prosthetic parts as often as they do clothing and shoes.
China is taking a revolutionary step in 3D printing, using biomaterials like cells that are placed inside the cartridge.
Doctors examined this printed part made from collagen gel used as the printer's ink.
It's a pretty impressive thing to see an object created where there was nothing.
Maybe China's going a little fast, but also the Chinese government is acutely aware of its pollution. It doesn't like nuclear power.
Nuclear energy is a kind of energy. It is safe.
People of the city make the life better.
或者握有 and the corn is limited source.
We had better not to use the coal.
Industry cannot get much energy from the sun.
China is a big country, and so nuclear power is necessary.
Why nuclear energy? Especially after what happened in Japan. And why molten salt reactor? And why thorium? And last but not the least, why China is the first one to eat the crab? That's Chinese saying. In 1994, the state of California passed a law of the zero emissions. And GM's EV1 came out in 1996 because they want very much like to catch the market of the California. The big oils heavily lobbying East Coast not to follow the same track as California did. Finally, GM called back all the EV1s from the market and crashed them in 2004. It's something to me like World War II NAS. It's amazing. It's very scary story here. Here is pure electrical car developed by Chinese Academy of Sciences. We used to have a dream, if we can produce a clean electricity, then we can drive our electrical car. However, if you look at this, as of today, it's all gasoline cars. So it makes our job even impossible. We need a revolutionary something happen. Why thorium? And why MSR? Low pressure here, which gives you more safety. We also end up with the high temperature here. we need high temperature. Because if you can go 900 degrees C, then we can use this energy to convert the CO2, which is not the waste at all. Is a raw material for our chemicals. In fact, we need the energy to convert them. We need the high temperature.
There's all sorts of very, very interesting chemistry that we have actually never even been able to have the opportunity to look at because we've never had a cheap energy platform at those temperatures. With a heat platform like a molten salt reactor, you can do any number of high temperature reactions.
We're still going to need liquid fuels for vehicles and machinery, but we could generate these liquid fuels from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and from water, much like nature does. We could generate hydrogen by splitting water and combining it with carbon harvested from CO2 in the atmosphere, making fuels like methanol, ammonia, and dimethyl ether, which could be a direct replacement for diesel fuels.
The whole planet's transportation system is gauged toward the consumption of a fossil fuel. There's an entire internal combustion infrastructure on the planet of fuel delivery, automobile repair, service stations, roads.
Imagine carbon neutral gasoline and diesel, sustainable and self-produced.
Which is a way of getting the full life cycle out of the infrastructure we've already built up. Because you don't want to just abandon the infrastructure we've already built up. We have trillions of dollars of internal combustion engine machinery around, but we need to at least stop putting more stuff in the air. You can not only halt the increase of CO2 emissions, you can start to reverse what was there and reverse the coming calamity of global warming.
The opportunities abound. I couldn't even tell you. There's so many possibilities. I wouldn't even want to predict. Wouldn't even want to.
There'll be no more blossom trees or tulips. There'll be no more babies. There'll be no more Mozart. There'll be no more Shakespeare. There'll be no more Parthenons or Gothic cathedrals or Europe. Out to 5 miles, every person would be literally vaporized, turned into gas. Out to 20 miles, every person would be lethally and dreadfully burnt. Winds of 500 miles an hour would suck people out of buildings, turning them to missiles. I don't think people understand. This is a product of annihilation.
That's one very negative way to look at nuclear material. Do we pump your car with gas and go, I just pumped 12 gallons of gas into my car. Do you know how much napalm that would make? No, of course not. I'm going to get my car, I'm going to drive 300 miles on it. I mean, it's all about what you do. None of this stuff is inherently good or bad. It's what you decide to do with it. Take nuclear weapons, take them apart, take the uranium out, burn it up, make electricity. That's a bad thing. Why? You want to leave it in the bomb? What do you want to do with it?
It's an absolutely wicked, wicked, wicked industry which kills people.
I'm a professional salsa dancer, chef, animal enthusiast, and I'm a nuke. I fabricate what I consider to be the next generation of nuclear fuels.
I'm a rock climber, I'm a wine aficionado, and I'm a nuke. I'm using nuclear processes in order to make better wine.
I'm a dessert baker, I'm a bassoonist, I'm a Quidditch player, and I'm a nuke. I work on high temperature corrosion and oxidation.
I'm an Australian, I'm a musician, and I'm a nuke, working on thermohydraulic analysis.
I'm Riri, I'm a dreamer, I'm a folk singer, and I'm nuke.
These people are long-term murderers. They know they are. They're fascinated with fission. It's sort of almost a testosterone supplement. I think it makes them feel strong and powerful because when you fission the atom, you actually harness the energy of the sun.
The basic reason we're interested in nuclear power as an energy source is because it represents an energy density far in excess of chemical energy.
E stands for energy, M for mass, and c squared is the speed of light multiplied by itself. C squared is a very great number. If multiplied by even a small mass, the result will be a very great amount of energy.
Nuclear fission is 1,000,000 times more energy dense than a chemical reaction. Now, you know, civilization has changed over advancements in technology a whole lot more modest than this. And this is also significant because there's really no in-between between chemical energy and nuclear energy. There's no atomic structure other than the electrons in the nucleus. It really is a change from going from chemical energies to nuclear energies, and it's a huge step.
They could easily put their minds to it and save the world with renewable energy.
We have to get beyond burning stuff for energy, and we can either go in two directions. We can go to a dispersed form of energy, which is gathering wind and solar, or we can go to a more concentrated form of energy, which is nuclear. And the disadvantage of wind and solar that will always exist is the amount of labor, energy, and expense of gathering and concentrating and directing that energy, because energy has to be collected and directed to do work. And nuclear energy has already been collected.
We're building these all over the country, a tower, and surrounded by giant mirrors in the desert that are manipulated by computers to always shine the sunlight. You know, a half hour after the sun gets up in the morning, where we can get that turbine to 750 degrees Fahrenheit.
Most of the ones that are kind of cute and cuddly, it's energy farming. And so the density, you know, the acreage involved, you know, the watts per square meter of those things, you know, it makes it very hard. And when you do farming, you get wind, you get snow, you get, you know, your capital equipment isn't in a coal plant that's protected from the elements. It's large and widespread. So that's very hard. But even if you get past that, there's the intermittency problem. And so if you depend on these sources, you have to have some way of getting energy during those time periods that it's not available.
During the day, we generate as much electricity as we can using solar. At night, and when it's cloudy, we use more natural gas. Each year, we probably get over 200 days of sunshine, but there's 165 more days without. As big as this solar plant is, it's not enough to meet our customers' needs. The plant operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. That's why we need natural gas.
Whether it's wind or solar, everybody is looking at gas as the supplementary fuel. The plants that we're building, the wind plants and the solar plants, are gas plants. You need to put them next to a natural gas pipe. But once we build a national grid, we don't have to do that, because the wind in this country blows at night, and the solar, everybody knows this, shines during the day. So, and those two will balance each other out, but you can't do that without an
if we rebuild
grid.
the entire electrical grid of the United States. Yeah.
Well, we're doing that piece by piece already.
Okay.
The insanity of the NIMBY thing, we're not running a high power line through my neighborhood, I'll get electromagnetic radiation. Yeah, Wired magazine, they're like, to get a new trunk line to San Francisco, they like went the opposite way, and they're like, is that far enough away from people? You know, it's longer and more transmission loss.
You have 2-week periods in the desert where you get no sun at all. Likewise, the wind doesn't blow all the time. All the types of batteries that get made for cars, for computers, for phones, for flashlights, for everything, could store less than 10 minutes of all the energy. We need a big breakthrough here, something that's going to be a factor of 100 better than the approaches we have now.
It's proven, like fusion was so hard to do, storing energy cheaply has been a remarkably difficult challenge for 50 to 100 years. Batteries are not cheap. We can't just try to put all our eggs in the basket of wind and solar and hope for the best. Or if it doesn't pan out, it's not going to be a pretty world.
There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch. There is always a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done. Always. There's no such thing as a waste-free energy source.
We kind of go solar, it's so clean. There's protests in China over pollution from solar plants.
In China's Zhejiang province in Haining City, over 500 villagers stormed a solar panel manufacturing company, overturning vehicles and destroying offices.
And that's to produce solar panels that offer 0.1% of our electricity, in contrast to 15% for nuclear. So when you go from 0.1% to 15% in any technology, you're going to have all sorts of unintended consequences.
Measurements were taken in Ireland where they were expecting a 12% reduction in CO2 from the wind farm's presence, but in reality they only observed a 3% reduction. The reason is that the fossil fuels that had to back them up had generators that had to start and stop. And that causes more fuel to be consumed. By analogy, cars have mileages of, say, 20 miles per gallon for city driving and 30 miles per gallon for highway driving.
Most positive press coverage on energy farming technologies focus on deployment, focus on generating capacity. How much carbon-free electricity was generated during the latest optimal conditions? Neither of these articles include any numbers at all about greenhouse gases. If you added up the impact of all the various greenhouse gases used to produce electricity in Germany, there was a moment in the middle of 2005 where it was equivalent to an annual output of 1,000 metric tons of CO2. A nice round number, 1,000 metric tons of global warming badness. Since then, German greenhouse gas emissions have fallen to the equivalent of 951 metric tons of CO2 annually. That's a 5% reduction in annual greenhouse gas emissions. During that same period, the percentage of German electricity being produced by renewables went from 10.5% to 23.5%, an increase of 13%. Germany only achieved a 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, even though Germans are generating an additional 13% of their electricity from renewables. This is partially because of inefficiencies caused by sporadically burning fossil fuel to back up intermittent renewables, but mostly because Germany is shutting down its nuclear power plants and replacing them with coal plants to meet its energy needs.
And I wouldn't talk like this unless I knew there were answers. Close down all those reactors now and stop burning fossil fuel now and fill the country up with solar and wind and geothermal and conservation. I mean, Germany's going to be 80% renewables very soon. Germany.
Soon? If the percentage of electricity generated by renewables continues to expand at the current rate, it will take just over 40 years for renewables to generate 80% of German electricity. Maybe by 80%, Caldicott meant peak load. It doesn't matter what day German renewable peak load finally reaches 80%, any more than it matters what percentage of German electricity comes from renewables.
I've just been in Germany and Austria, and lots of the little farmhouses now are covered in solar panels. Germany's moving fast.
For the billions of dollars they've thrown at solar and wind, Germany is barely making a dent in their greenhouse gas emissions.
My government in Australia, they've done a great job. They're reducing it by 5%. I mean, that's nothing. It's neither here nor there. 5%. That's nothing.
No one stays in a location because it's such a nice place. When you can't run your business, then you have to take appropriate steps. The difference of paying the renewable surcharge or not here in Germany is in the region of 400 million euros. And that's on a scale that would endanger the entire basis of our business.
Energiewende, the German energy turnaround, is so costly that the question of allocation those costs comes to the top of the agenda. And what we have to do now is trying to reduce those costs for the future.
When they get to be any meaningful percentage, that's where the problem of their intermittency becomes overwhelming. And you can actually spend way more to try and solve that problem than you spend on the overpriced stuff to begin with. I think people deeply underestimate what a huge problem that is. The economics are so far from being appropriate.
Now, Bill Gates, I think, is doing some good work with this money. He's setting out to immunise all the children of the world. He is taking responsibility. You can do wonderful things with money if you've got it.
As I got focused on the work of my foundation and the lives of the poor, and I looked at what innovations could improve their lives, allow them to have cheaper food fertilizer, to have more building materials, to have a refrigerator, to have light to read at night, I realized the very central role that energy plays in improving their livelihood. And so we need breakthroughs. Now, if the solar guys, get 10 times as cheap and solve the storage challenges they face and the transmission difficulties where the energy's not exactly where you need it, that's wonderful. In fact, I invest some in those areas. But when you look at the numbers and you say, what could be significantly cheaper than what we have today and located in every area, nuclear is one of the few that may be able to achieve that.
They trot people like Bill Gates and out there to be our friends and to sell us this stuff.
Yeah, but you don't have to believe Bill Gates because he's filthy rich.
Well, yeah, but a lot of people do.
Yeah, but don't. I mean, where's your cynicism?
That's what I'm saying.
Americans are very gullible. Americans kind of believe everything they're told.
Can I get you guys to sign a petition?
What for?
For banning dihydrogen monoxide?
Oh, yeah, I'll sign that.
Thank you very much. It causes a lot of urination.
We sent one of our pals, Chris McGaha, to a rally to collect signatures for a petition banning dihydrogen monoxide.
This is a petition for dihydrogen monoxide. What it is it's a chemical that is found now in reservoirs and in lakes.
Water.
Pesticides, different kind of companies are using this. Styrofoam companies, nuclear companies. And now when they use it in pesticides, when we're washing our fruit and things like that, it's not coming out.
And she's not going to lie or even stretch the truth. Not at all. She's just going to talk about what water is and what it does with the vocabulary and tone of environmental hysteria.
Which of course means that it's ended up in the grocery stores and in our babies' food and stuff like that. It causes excessive sweating, excessive urination.
We don't know if they thought, but they signed. There we are.
Americans are very gullible. Americans kind of believe everything they're told.
The problem is rich countries can afford to overpay for things. We can overpay for medicine, we can overpay for energy. In the world where most people live, 80%, energy is going to be bought where it's economic so that they can buy cheap fertilizer and grow enough crops to feed themselves. Where do you put the subsidies? Do you put subsidies on R&D? Mm-hmm. Do you put the subsidies on the deployment? Mm-hmm. Today we're putting overwhelmingly 90% of the subsidies are on deployment. This is true in Europe, it's true in the United States, not on the R&D piece. And so unfortunately you get technologies that no matter how much volume you buy of them, there's no learning curve that makes it economic. Buy as much as you want, it's not going to happen. You need fundamental breakthroughs, which more come out of basic research. If you can make it economic and meet the CO2 constraint, then the skeptics say, okay, I don't care that it doesn't put out CO2. I kind of wish it did put out CO2, but I guess I'll accept it because it's cheaper than what's come before.
If you have energy cheaper than coal, we can solve that world climate and population problem because it will be in the economic self-interest of 250 nations to buy those cheaper power sources rather than burning coal.
We're going to exhaust every option to deal with global warming until we finally get clear that actually what matters is making clean energy cheap, so that we can live in a world where we mostly live in cities, we have high-intensive agriculture, we've got clean energy, we've got clean water, we've got recycling your materials. That's a vision of a world where we can all live modern lives, and it does not require any science fiction.
This goes back a ways now. How did you become so interested in nuclear power?
When I was 15, I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute, and it was about a nuclear war that occurred by accident. I always knew there was this impending threat of doom, and I've known that ever since.
I read an Isaac Asimov story about the implications of what free energy would do.
Raise your hand if you've read The High Frontier. Well, we all knew we needed energy, and solar energy sure seemed great. Build these things and they're going to shoot the energy back. I bring all this up because, this really affected the way I thought. I was like, yeah, Sign me up for this.
And I sort of knew I wanted something, I was going to be an engineer or scientist just from day one. And this sort of said, okay, what can you do to make a difference? And that was where I sort of said advanced nuclear power was something that could make a difference, and that low cost, clean energy could make a huge difference to society. If I'm going to have to get up every day for 50 or 60 years and working on something, well, it ought to be something I believe in.
Well, when I was about 16, I read a book called On the Beach by Neville Shute.
I remember it well.
And I lived in Melbourne, which is where the book was set.
Right.
So there's a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere which could occur tonight. And we all survived, but no one else did because we're so far south. And gradually the radiation came down. And then the government dispensed cyanide capsules to kill the babies so they'd die suddenly, not with the lingering effects of vomiting and bloody diarrhea. And then eventually everyone died. And the beautiful, elegant streets of Melbourne were still there, with St George slaying the dragon outside the public library, and a blind was gently flapping in the breeze. And that was the end of life on Earth. I lost my virginity then. I never trusted anyone again. I read everything I could find about nuclear weapons. I then did first year medicine, aged 17, learned about Muller, who irradiated Drosophila fruit fly and produced genetic abnormalities passed on generation to generation. So I understood what radiation did.
The key issue here is really the influence of Muller, and they were looking at the effects of ionizing radiation on fruit fly germ cells.
They didn't do low-dose research. They're low-dose. They're zapping fruit flies with X-rays to see what mutations occur, right? Well, their lowest dose was like 100 to 1,000 X-rays. That's not a low dose. X-rays today are pretty mild, but in 1946 you had to expose film, not a silicon chip. 1,000 X-rays is what they were doing in 3.5 minutes. Imagine if you sat through 1,000 1946 X-rays in 3.5 minutes. Despite his experiments having a very limited range of strengths of radiation that the fruit flies were exposed to, he extrapolated down to zero radiation in a way that is called a linear no threshold, meaning that there is damage done to organisms no matter how little the radiation is until you reach no radiation.
It's based on the assumption that radiation will harm you at whatever degree to whatever degree you're exposed. It is established in regulation, yet there is no epidemiological data to back that up. There is no study that says we have taken a cohort of people and we've exposed them to 1% more radiation than normally would get, and we've seen 1% more cancer. In fact, there are many places in the world where background levels of radiation are substantially higher than they are for regular places. If the linear no threshold hypothesis was in fact true, or even approaching truth, you would see statistically significantly higher levels of cancer in those populations, those cohorts. But what happens? Not only is there not higher levels of cancer, there are actually suppressed levels of cancer.
Caspary found no support for the linear model, but actually found support for a threshold. And this was in a very large study with the most sophisticated advancements in methodology, and also at by far the lowest dose rate that had ever been tested. So it was, at that point, the best test for a low-dose effect.
Caspary dug in, and Caspary wanted to see, well, was he right or was he wrong? And so Caspary dug deep into the literature. He actually got much unpublished data from Muller himself.
Well, Muller writes back on November 12th. This is the smoking gun. He writes back on November 12th and said he got it. He kind of scanned the whole thing. He looked at it. He saw the data. The data actually conflicted with his linear paradigm. It was very disturbing. The study has to be replicated. He can't challenge the work because Caspary was a very good scientist. He laid out that he knew the story, and he had been a consultant all the way through as well. He knew the implications. He knew that it was the best study to date. But what did he do? He just threw it under the bus.
He was asked to give testimony to the National Academy of Sciences regarding the effects of radiation.
He basically makes the claim that one can no longer accept the belief that there is a threshold relationship. He says that, we have to accept a linear perspective.
Now, you can call that lying, you can call that mischievous, you can call it anything you want, but it wasn't being honest.
We know the linear no-threshold hypothesis is not true. Living organisms have repair mechanisms that make up for both chemical and radiological damage.
The notion there's no safe amount of radiation, that is not a substantiated or even an accurate statement. It is probably actually utterly inaccurate, but it is commonly found as the basis of public policy around the world.
The linear no-threshold hypothesis came from a point in time when we really didn't know much about radiation, we didn't know much about cell behavior internally, and we didn't know very much at all about how cancer occurs.
In the original Caspary study, Caspary concluded that there was a likely threshold, a tolerance for radiation. And Muller's name was not on there. When it was ultimately published in 1948, the conclusion removed a single sentence, and that was a sentence that there was likely a threshold of tolerance, and the only thing that it added was the name of Muller as a consultant. And so it's very, very interesting. No data were changed. That was the only changes that were made. Removal of the threshold conclusion, addition of Muller as a consultant.
Basic dose response for risk assessment was altered from a threshold to linearity.
It's born of a history of deception and fraud and ideological manipulation.
If you believe LNT, then any little bit of radiation poses a threat to you. You'd also want to evacuate all states like Colorado, anywhere that's high up or has large background levels of radiation.
Well, we're constantly bathed by radiation all our lives, and our cells are capable of repairing one radiation damage event per second per cell. What you have to take a look at is the amount of radiation you absorb over how much time. If you get it all at once, yeah, you'll die, or yeah, you'll get cancer, or yeah, you'll get a sunburn or a melanoma, but you get a little bit every day, and that's actually fine.
We just do not have any evidence that below about 10% of what will kill you, which is a lot of radiation, that there's really any ill effects. There's countless places in the world that are far more radioactive than outside the gates at Fukushima. So many people died or suffered from that mass evacuation that is pretty much needless. Even the worst case nuclear accidents of complete meltdown, it still gets very hard for us to kill people.
Who gets more radiation, an airline pilot or a nuclear submarine commander? And most people, of course, choose the nuclear submarine commander. Why? That reactor is right next to them. Well, the reality is the reactor is well shielded, and because they're underwater, they're not getting radiation from space, because space is where we get much of our radiation. So the pilot is actually getting much more radiation than the crew or captain of the nuclear submarine. Right now, I'm being irradiated. About half of it's coming from the sky because space is radioactive. This substance I'm standing on is radioactive. This church behind me, made out of stone, is probably radioactive stone. And I had fruit for this morning. There's radioactive potassium in there. My body needs it, but it's radioactive.
It's really what we have to focus the debate on is learning and understanding this, I have to say, irrational fear of nuclear power, because short of Chernobyl, if you look at the scientific literature, they had hundreds of thousands of people that got a lot of radiation, getting close to that 10%. They can't seem to find excess cancers in those. Even if you use that kind of discredited linear no threshold, they would estimate I believe it's 3,000 to 4,000 deaths worldwide. Now that is a disaster, but if that's the one disaster we've had in decades of nuclear power compared to dam bursts or natural gas explosions, all these other things, I mean, come on, people, it's look at this rationally. That's all we're asking you to do.
When I really had a hard look at nuclear power, what I saw staring back at me were my own prejudices, my own biases, my blocks, my ignorance, and my indoctrination.
I worked at Friends of the Earth, who, a green campaign group in the UK, and I was an anti-nuclear campaigner. And so, over time, my objection to nuclear has kind of fallen away as I've got to know different aspects of it.
Ted and I were raised in the anti-nuclear movement, went to anti-nuclear rallies throughout our childhoods, were anti-nuclear until we were forced to actually understand the low carbon technological options we have.
I thought nuclear power was dumb. I had no interest in it. I was like, oh, old junk.
I was very, very opposed to nuclear power with no information whatsoever. And I was asked to teach a course on it. And in the process of teaching a course, I changed my mind. Most people do not change their mind when they are confronted with information that is contrary to their preconceptions.
People generally make decisions emotionally rather than logically.
You make your decision whether or not you like nuclear power, and then you rationalize it.
Exactly. You make your decision, and then you go and you are interested in data that supports your decision, and you're uninterested in data that doesn't.
Germany did a classic study of children under the age of 5 living less than 5 kilometres from 16 reactors. Their incidence of leukemia was more than double normal. That study was then duplicated by the French. So they don't need to do another study.
The first one looked at leukemia rates among German children living within a 5-kilometer radius of any operating nuclear reactor. Where 17 incidents of leukemia would have been expected, researchers instead found 37 cases. The second study looked at leukemia rates among French children living within 5 kilometers of any operating nuclear reactor. Where 7 cases of leukemia would have been expected, researchers instead found 14 cases. In both studies, childhood leukemia rates near reactors are doubled. Also, in both studies, researchers strongly cautioned against attributing the increase in leukemia to any radioactive emission from the reactors. How could the researchers involved in both studies see a doubling of leukemia rates near reactors and then argue against blaming reactor emissions as the cause? Wouldn't anyone like to know?
And those 2 studies are classic studies. They don't need to do any more studies. QED, it's proven.
No, it is not that interesting to everybody. Both the French and German studies measured leukemia rates against distance from nuclear power plants and found almost identical results. The French study followed the German one and so attempted to address confounding factors that the German study did not. The French study used 2 geographic models. One was simply distance to the reactor, as the German study had done. The second incorporated wind direction to more closely model where any radioactive emissions from the reactor would be distributed. The excess cases of leukemia disappeared when using this more accurate weather model, meaning the vast majority of leukemia cases were not downwind from the reactors as one might expect when trying to associate leukemia with reactor emission. This curious finding was then explored further in a UK study which saw elevated leukemia rates where nuclear power plants were planned but had not been constructed. Nuclear power plants may be located close to cities and large population centers, but they're not dropped in the middle of housing units. Most frequently, in Europe, they're found in small industrial towns. They're typically built near factories, populated with blue-collar workers, possibly on land already saturated with chemicals from the previous industrial occupant. The vast majority of scientific research finds no increase in cancer or leukemia. Note again, researchers of both the German and French leukemia studies cautioned against presuming nuclear power plant emission was the cause. So what does Caldicott do? Cite the reports as evidence of just that.
That's a classic study, and that's because reactors continually emit tritium. You can't operate a reactor without tritium.
George Monbiot once deferred to Caldicott on matters of nuclear power and radiation. In 2011, shortly after the Fukushima disaster and a discussion with Caldicott on Democracy Now!,
this is the biggest medical conspiracy and cover-up in the history of medicine, George.
He wrote, The anti-nuclear movement to which I once belonged has misled the world about the impacts of radiation on human health. The claims we have made are ungrounded in science, unsupportable when challenged, and wildly wrong. We have done other people and ourselves a terrible disservice. Helen Caldicott, the world's foremost anti-nuclear campaigner, made some striking statements about the dangers of radiation. I asked for the sources. Caldicott's response has profoundly shaken me. None were scientific publications. None contained sources for the claims she made.
Inside the Earth, thorium and uranium are decaying, and they're decaying very slowly, but there's a lot of them, and the Earth is big. They produce most of the heat that drives the internal processes of the Earth. They produce the heat that drives plate tectonics. They produce the heat that drives the generation of the magnetic field. So if we didn't have the energy from thorium inside the Earth, we would be on a dead planet.
The majority of American geothermal is harvested in the state of California, which has most of its geothermal energy harvested in the Imperial Valley. A typical Imperial Valley geothermal plant produces 40 tons of radioactive waste every day.
They're saddled with all our radioactive waste. Who do we think we are, Bob?
Geothermal is creating 200 times the volume of radioactive waste that nuclear reactors do per watt of power.
I don't want to wear a dosimeter. Don't want to calculate rems and sievers. I don't want to see no cleanup crews. Or get zapped before I hear the news. We can get the heat from earth and sun. And hook the wind to make the engines run. If common sense could only start a chain reaction of the human heart. What a wonderful world this would be. We hope that you'll hear inspiring words from Helen. We're honored to have her here.
I might show you some slides. What really is in a nuclear reactor. Barium, lanthanum, cerium, presidium, I can't pronounce that, promethium, samarium, europium. They name them up, a lot of them after themselves, these physicists. That's the most important slide you're going to see tonight. And that's what nobody knows.
You have some fissile nuclei. That means this is a nucleus that if you hit it with a neutron, the nucleus begins to distend and a piece comes off. And the smaller piece is about 30 or 40% the original mass of the nucleus, and the larger fission product is basically what was left over. And so what this leads to a double humped distribution in the masses of the fission products. On this table, you see the smaller fission product highlighted in yellow, and then the heavier fission product highlighted in green. And then there is what's called the transuranics. That's what happens when the uranium absorbs the neutron and doesn't fission. It turns into plutonium and americium and curium and a few others. Most of it's plutonium. I mean, the overwhelming majority of transuranics are plutonium. You get a lot of different things from fission, but you don't get everything, and that's significant. It's not as if you're dumping the whole periodic table out when you make fission. You get certain elements in a preponderance, and you get some very rarely, and you get some not at all. For instance, you can't make gold from fission. When we first load nuclear fuel in a uranium-fueled reactor, it is entirely uranium, and most of that is uranium-238. As it burns down, first at a year, 2 years, and then 3 years, you see the formation of other things. These are the fission products, as well as some of the transuranics. The hatch at the bottom gives away the fact that most of the rod is still uranium-238. The overwhelming majority is still this unburned uranium-238. Still, most of that potential energy remains to be exploited. In fact, the only fraction that has been truly burned is the fraction you see kind of in those light pastel colors. Those are the fission products. But the remainder of the material is unrealized energy. Xenon is the most common of the fission products. NASA uses xenon to throw out the backside of an ion engine. We used to joke at NASA that xenon was one of the few things worth launching into space because it actually cost about as much as it cost to put up in space.
One man's waste is another man's treasure. If you come up with clever ways of utilizing that waste, you can help a lot of people and you can monetize that waste. And you can do it safely, and you can do it in some cases for very strategic reasons.
Imagine taking everything out of your pantry and pouring it on the floor. So your sugar and your cornflakes and your flour and your baked beans and everything is in a big pile on the floor. How valuable is that giant mix to you?
It's not valuable at all.
It's worthless. It's completely worthless. All you do is you'd shovel it up and you throw it in the trash. Now, you've had the same stuff you had a minute ago, but now it's all been mixed together. What makes the stuff in your pantry valuable is the fact that it is separated. The sugar's in one container and the flour's in another and your cornflakes are in another altogether. So what we've got with nuclear waste is we've got that pile of everything mixed together. If we could partition it, if we could put it back in its separate categories, we would find that almost every one of those things is useful if isolated and separated from everything else. Right now, all mixed together, worthless. Worthless and dangerous. But partitioned, they could be very, very valuable.
But since the fission products are thoroughly mixed with the uranium, we need chemistry to separate them out. Pyroprocessing, a nifty technology invented by argon scientists.
What the physicists have been dreaming about forever. Chop them up by remote control into small pieces and dissolve them
in a vat of molten salts. When you run an electric current through the vat, the uranium and transuranics separate out and forms crystals on the electrodes.
They call it pyroprocessing, but it's a molten salt process. They're dissolving this thing in a molten salt and they're doing electrochemistry on it.
Well, we were young chemical engineers at the time. God smiles on young chemical engineers. They do things that in later years would be regarded as crazy.
He worked with some of the smartest engineers and chemists and scientists at the time about how do we turn thorium into a reality. And they began investigating some very, very radical nuclear reactors, totally different than the kind of stuff we have now, based on the idea that you could take salts and that they would be a really good medium in which to have a nuclear reaction.
Liquid salts are an outstanding heat transfer media. It really doesn't matter what you're going to be transferring heat for, whether this be a solar power tower, whether this be a salt-cooled reactor, a molten salt reactor. The hazards on this, the same thing as hazards on a deep fat fryer, which is I trip. Throwing hot oil or hot salt in this case on visitors would be considered a bad thing. But there's nothing else to this, it just makes a nice little clear liquid. But I'll just pour this out into a little stainless steel crucible. At 450, I mean, this thing is a solid. So it doesn't take very long for it to form the solid again.
Isn't that a nice feature?
If you had a little crack on this and it was it was starting to weep, it forms a plug.
Self-plugging.
A self-plug.
That's a nice thing, not being under pressure.
On the other hand, if your design keeps the vessel hot, it'll stay liquid on there, but that's why you have a guard vessel. If absolute worst case happens and you have massive vessel rupture, well, you still catch it.
This is an old facility. Look down before you walk. That's our biggest hazard here right now.
Oh my goodness. Yes, yes. I've modeled this shape neutronically.
It is like a lead pencil, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Basically.
We just returned from a trip to Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and one of the exciting things that the Baroness and I got to do was to tour the molten salt reactor experiment, which was one of these type of reactors that was built in the 1960s.
The device that I was using got stuck in the wrong place and pulled the rod out, and the power went up and up beyond the design power, and then controlled itself and went back down. Wow. Everybody was happy. It's an inherently safe reactor. The dynamics were, let's say, not common to reactors because it was molten salt instead of water-cooled solid fuel.
You could change the load on this radiator by moving the doors down, and the reactor would follow the load. Just about any molten salt concept that has been seriously considered has been shown to have this stable behavior.
If you have the molten salt in the core region and it heats up, it gets less dense, and that means it's less critical.
Or less reactive.
Yeah, less reactive.
Yeah.
it sounds like it was quite a boring job in a way, but did you feel fondly towards this reactor design?
Oh, yes.
It wasn't at all boring.
I meant boring in the sense that, it was quite safe. And
It did exactly what we calculated it ought to do, and that's pretty satisfying.
The Navy program that led to the light water reactors we have now was well optimized to the needs of the Navy. It actually wasn't very well optimized to the needs of power production.
Nuclear is one of the directions that we should innovate in. Nuclear innovation stopped in the 1970s. We basically have this sub-design thing that was put into Shippingport for the first power generator, and we basically built 400 of those that are all kind of custom, but not in any interesting way. They're all LWRs and PWRs. And the industry did not innovate.
The reason we have that as the base for our power reactor technology today is because the Navy was prepared to pay the first mover costs to make one work. And once you've done that, it's extraordinarily difficult to compete with it because those first mover costs are very, very high and have no financial return associated with them.
Were either of you present when the molten salt reactor program was canceled in the early 70s?
Yeah, we were still working there.
Well, I was still working on the system. We were still finalizing reports on the performance of the MSRE.
I didn't see it coming.
You put your hand on your desk, take everything that has to do with molten salt, sweep it off, and you're finished.
I saved all my documents.
I did too.
The most important difference is that this machine uses liquid fuel. What process do we run chemically based on solids? We don't. Everything we do, we use as liquids or gases because we can mix them completely. You can take a liquid, you can fully mix it. You can take a gas, you can fully mix it. You can't take a solid and fully mix it unless you turn it into a liquid or a gas. This machine uses liquid fuel rather than solid fuel, and that's really the key to its safety and efficiency. Safety is one of the most important reasons to consider very seriously molten salt reactors, and this is because of the clever implementation that was demonstrated in the molten salt reactor experiment of the freeze plug and the drain tank. They had a blower that would blow cool gas over it, so there was a little plug of frozen salt there. Well, if the power went out, the blower turned off, and the heat would melt the frozen plug, and guess what? Psh, the fuel drained into this drain tank, and the difference between the drain tank and the reactor vessel was the reactor vessel was not meant to lose any thermal energy. The only place you wanted to lose thermal energy was to give it up in the primary heat exchanger. The drain tank, on the other hand, is designed to maximize the rejection of thermal energy to the environment. And I'm a mechanical engineer, so all we ever talked about in school was how to, add heat to things and take heat out of things. And one of the hard things about designing a nuclear reactor is design it to not lose any heat while you're running it, because you don't want to lose a bunch of heat in normal operation, but then to turn around and try to keep it cool if something goes wrong. So there are two conflicting things. The great thing about liquid fluoride reactors is you can design them completely separately. You can say, here's my reactor and it's designed to make heat, and here's my drain tank and it's designed to cool in all situations. Better than having what's called deterministic safety systems or engineered safety systems is to have inherent safety systems that will work 100% of the time because it is based on the laws of physics. A cooling system that is completely passive, that does not rely at all on electrical power to manage the decay heat after shutdown. And it's always going to work because gravity is always going to be turned on. Because it was not operating at high pressure, this is a system that was tolerant of extraordinary damage. I mean, if you wanted to go in and jam a projectile through the side of the reactor, the salt would still just drain out now into a pan, but the pan would run back into the drain tank. Now in that situation, you're not going to turn the thing right back on again, but it's not going to lead to a dangerous release of radioactivity. In reactors today, there's basically two categories of the waste. There's the fission product waste, and then there's the transuranic waste. That's what happens when the uranium absorbs the neutron and doesn't fission it. The plutonium, the americium, the curium. By using the thorium cycle and using it efficiently, we can eliminate that category, the production of transuranics. We can just about eliminate that, so we're not making that in the first place. We are still making the fission products, and a number of those I mentioned can be extracted usefully. By extracting the first four fission products, xenon, neodymium, zirconium, and molybdenum, right away you've reduced the waste stream considerably.
I know that I can save lives by using those isotopes. I know that I can better society with those isotopes. And then the other side of the coin is, if you're going to use thorium as your baseload fuel, so to speak, you have to have a kickstarter. The uranium-235 that's still left over, the plutonium-239. But hey, isn't that a great way to get rid of these materials?
Molten salt can not only be a fuel, it's a way to reprocess or process nuclear fuels and clean them up for reuse.
You hate nuclear waste? So do I. These reactors can eat nuclear waste.
Take some of the waste that's already been created in our uranium-fueled reactors and potentially destroy those long-lived transuranics through fission. Waiting them out to decay is a very slow process.
We hate nuclear waste too, but what we really hate is we hate wasting it.
For all Helen Caldicott's concern about our current stockpile of partially spent fuel, she offers no solution on what to do with it.
So the only way to prevent being exposed to radiation is to close down all the nuclear reactors in the world and to get into renewable energy. Then you're still stuck with the radioactive waste, which is the legacy we leave to our descendants, which is really criminal.
Unspent nuclear fuel is a Helen Caldicott problem, not an engineering problem. Already existing nuclear waste is its own independent, addressable issue, an issue which hasn't been addressed yet only because people like Helen Caldicott
They don't know what's out there. They don't know.
block every attempt to improve storage of these stockpiles. Similarly, reactors that consume nuclear waste as fuel ought to have some sort of appeal.
So the thing that's been a problem from those reactors is actually what gets fed into ours, and you're reducing the volume of the waste quite dramatically as you're going through this process.
Making it cease to exist and making carbon-free energy with it in the process, wouldn't that be a slightly better deal than burying it? Would you please consider that as an option?
Think of all the different car models we have on the road. That's how many different ways there are to design a nuclear reactor.
Dr. Alvin Weinberg, who had a huge part in developing the light water reactor, begged several administrations from Kennedy to Nixon to please, this is what a civilian nuclear reactor should be. You should use thorium, and you should use molten salts.
Not a single one has been cited by anti-nuclear organizations as worthy of development. Today's reactors are mostly a category called pressurized water reactors. They can't consume partially spent fuel rods. They don't use molten salt. They've been producing carbon-free electricity for us since 1958. In a way, pressurized water reactors are pretty boring. The Westinghouse AP1000 is the very latest pressurized water reactor. No AP1000 is operating yet, but 8 are under construction. AP1000 are made of prefabricated parts, allowing on-site assembly rather than on-site construction. AP1000 also incorporates passive safety features never before seen in a nuclear reactor, any one of which would have prevented the meltdown at Fukushima. Here, Helen Caldicott is asked about the future of nuclear power. She has not been specifically asked about the AP1000. She feels obliged to bring it up herself.
Generation 3 reactors, which are what they're building now in South Georgia, which is an AP1000, which is still a light water reactor like the ones you have here, but it's cheaper because it's got less steel and less concrete in it, and it's called an eggshell reactor in the industry, so it could easily have an accident. It's very dangerous.
What was that last thing again?
And it's called an eggshell reactor in the industry. Can you believe that?
No, an eggshell reactor is not what the industry calls the AP1000. That's like the solar industry referring to concentrated thermal as a Kentucky Fried Chicken tower. Or the wind power industry calling their latest windmill a bird blender. It is true that the AP1000 uses less steel and concrete. In fact, it uses fewer pumps, valves, and control cables too. It is a more compact reactor, and it takes advantage of passive safety over engineered safety wherever possible. AP1000 was approved by the NRC in 2005. Prior to the AP1000, the last reactor certified by NRC was in 1978. This is a 1978 computer. This is a 1978 car. have we learned nothing at all in 27 years about reactor safety, about constructing stronger buildings with less material thanks to modern composites? The lower cost of AP1000 is primarily due to factory construction and on-site assembly, not by sheer volume of parts or concrete. These AP1000 could survive a direct hit from a hijacked commercial airplane. Understanding the safety improvements found in the AP1000 is like studying the basket weaving 101 of nuclear power. The improvements are 27 years' worth of common sense.
Loss of off-site power. At the same time, the standby diesel generators fail to start, resulting in a station blackout. Outside of the containment vessel, cooler air passes over the steel. As the steam is condensing to water on the steel walls inside of the containment vessel, the decay heat is transferred from the steam to the steel.
How can anyone who's dedicated her entire life to studying all things nuclear not know exactly what an AP1000 is and where the cost savings are coming from?
An AP1000, which is still a light water reactor like the ones you have here, but it's cheaper because it's got less steel and less concrete in it, and it's called an eggshell reactor in the industry, so it could easily have an accident. It's very dangerous.
If nuclear power were clean, safe, economic, and assured of ample fuel, and socially benign per se, it would still be unattractive because of the political implications of the kind of energy economy it would lock us into. That's Amory Lovins, the man who persuaded a generation of environmental leaders that you could power modern human civilization on energy coming from wind and solar. An amazing proposition.
I've worked for major oil companies for about 35 years.
Dr. Gordon Edwards, recipient of the Nuclear Free Future Award. It may be that one day, after all the power reactors have been shut down and folks have weaned themselves off nuclear power, some version of a molten salt reactor may be useful for waste management purposes. But not now. To do it now would just be unleashing the dogs of nuclear expansionism. Greenpeace Conference Strategy Notes. Close nuclear power down by halting development of new disposal facilities. Reject efforts to negotiate an agreement for siting the repository. Continue to stall until Congress gives up on the repository program. You would think any organization constantly warning us about radiation from nuclear waste would want to see it moved to and monitored in an underground geological repository. You would think anyone considering the use of molten salt reactors to help dispose of nuclear waste would simultaneously use them to generate electricity, since the unavoidable side effect is the release of massive amounts of energy. You would think anyone concerned about global warming would be keen to deploy any energy solution that was clean, safe, economic, and sustainable. And you would think Dr. Helen Caldicott would know an AP1000 from a hole in the ground. If their goal was safe nuclear power, yes, but their goal is the elimination of nuclear power.
We have to have humility and understand who we are, and then we're not. We're not God. We're just fallible human beings who make mistakes, and therefore we must eradicate all things nuclear.
Improvements to safety, less expensive reactors, and nuclear waste repositories make nuclear power more attractive. Therefore, safe reactors and relocation of fuel rods must always be fought, no matter how reasonable the proposal is.
No dose is safe. You never need your teeth x-rayed, except if you've got an abscess. Don't get your breasts x-rayed every 2 years. No, they don't understand how radiation causes cancer. They don't know that each dose they receive causes cancer. Have pictures of fetal defects and deformed babies and all the rest. I mean, make it come home.
Perhaps the most unintended consequence achieved by such fear-mongering is the hobbling of the very renewable technologies Caldicott insists we switch to. There's a critical role for wind and solar to play in the fight against poverty and climate change. This is because some of the costs of operating a nuclear reactor remain fixed. No matter how little electricity is required from it, you still need security and well-trained operators on site 24/7. Gigawatt nuclear reactors are well suited to powering large cities. About half the world's population does not live in cities.
You see the 7 billion people up there? The air people, the wash people, the bulb people, and the fire people.
In the poorest nations outside of cities, there's no access to electricity at all, so even a few watts per person can make a huge improvement to their quality of life and chance for prosperity. Solar and wind can scale down much further than nuclear can to meet basic human needs: the need for electricity, the need for light. Imagine only being able to work or read in the evening by burning something.
Well, Mozart and Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. Ooh, candlelight? I'm writing an article for the International Herald Tribune now about the future of nuclear power, and I ended it by saying that and said, the editor wrote back and said, well, you don't want to encourage people to think they have to go to candlelight again.
The International Herald Tribune editor objected to her call for a return to candlelight.
Well, what's wrong with candlelight?
That's right.
Did she actually ask the editor that question? Does she ever ask questions? Not hypothetically of the audience, but actually ask questions, exploring how she might be wrong. Burning a candle produces more heat than light. Even an old incandescent nightlight bulb, powered by a coal plant, emits far less CO2 than burning a candle, to say nothing of fluorescence or modern LED lighting.
Don't forget, Mozart wrote by candlelight. 200 years ago, there were 1 billion people, and now there are 7 billion.
Helen, this is Basket Weaving 101 of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You stop burning carbon. Photovoltaic solar, plus a battery, plus light-emitting diodes, solve this problem quite nicely, and they can scale from handheld to streetlights. Similarly, off-the-grid energy needs in America are being met by renewables. As a community or outpost's needs grow past what can be inexpensively produced by renewables, energy can then be provided by a small modular reactor. But under 25 megawatts, a nuclear reactor is an inappropriate energy solution. There simply is no such thing as a thorium-powered car. So the world does have a need for renewables, and we'd all be better off if they were as inexpensive as possible.
Everybody had their earphones in their ears while I've been talking to try to drown me out? There you go, thank you. Older folks like me will recall a day when earphones didn't look like that. It was more like this. There were these big things that went over our ears. The whole trick to that has been the invention of a little magnet based on neodymium iron boron magnets. Extremely powerful magnets, and they use a rare earth mineral called neodymium. One of the places they find application is in the generators that sit on top of windmills. Because if you're going to put a generator on a windmill, on this really, really high stock, you want it to be as lightweight as possible. Now, why am I talking about neodymium? Well, I have a friend who's trying to start a rare earth mine in Missouri.
Every known way to extract rare earths from their mineral concentrates, thorium just literally drops out like a rock and you have it.
And all he wants is to just not have to treat the thorium as a nuclear waste. He's not saying, I'm not going to sell it yet. I'm just going to set it aside for future use. How much thorium do you think you'll be pulling up a year? I think about 5,000 tons. 5,000 tons of thorium would supply the planet with all of its energy for a year.
The thorium is free, so it's going to be the most valuable commodity in the world with almost no value.
And he goes, and there's like a zillion other places on Earth that are just like my mine. It's a nice mine, but it's not unique. It's not like this is the one place on Earth where this is found.
Domestic content of major wind power components. Which one of these wind turbine components produce mildly radioactive thorium as a byproduct of their production?
It's the most important slide you're going to see tonight, and that's what nobody knows. What really is in a nuclear reactor.
We are still making the fission products, and a number of those I mentioned can be extracted usefully. By extracting the first 4 fission products, xenon, neodymium, zirconium, and molybdenum, right away you've reduced the waste stream considerably.
Barium, lanthanum, cerium, presidium, I can't pronounce that.
Whether wind turbines are imported or constructed within the United States, the required neodymium for the magnets in their generators is imported. Even domestically mined rare earth deposits containing neodymium make a round trip to China, where the thorium is separated and retained before the neodymium is shipped back to the United States.
You mustn't leave your lights on. You've got to turn your lights off as you walk from room to room. Turn off your lights.
And of course, we do efficiency. That is the foundation of everything.
Turn them off.
Efficient use of energy to produce light in fluorescent lights, compact fluorescent lights, and LEDs all take advantage of rare earth phosphorus to improve brightness and color balance of white light.
There's a new solar technique developed by a South African scientist that uses a micro-thin metallic film, which is 5 times more economical and efficient than the present PV solar voltaic cells.
Thin film solar voltaic contains indium. 95% of naturally occurring indium is mildly radioactive.
Well, we don't have to stop driving cars. What we need to do is put solar panels on all the parking lots. And so you have an electric car.
Liquid metal hydride batteries contain lanthanum.
In the early 1900s, with Henry Ford, the vehicle of choice were all electric vehicles. And then the gasoline engine and the internal combustion engine made that obsolete because of the economics. So we've all been looking for the next generation of batteries. And then when you move into an all-electric vehicle, it weighs around 600 to 700 pounds. And also they're around $12,000 to $15,000. Now this is $12,000 to $15,000 out of a $22,000 car. So you can see why the economics are what they are.
Mildly radioactive thorium is a byproduct of refining lanthanum, so we import it rather than processing it ourselves.
If you had solar panels on every house and the whole area covered with windmills and geothermal and cogeneration, millions of jobs would be created a la FDR. The New Deal. This is the new deal. This is the new energy deal.
Every time you build a windmill, you create jobs in China because they have the neodymium and dysprosium. And it's also increasingly true for solars.
Why aren't there solar panels on all the parking lots? So you buy your electric car from China, plug it in during the day, and it's a solar-powered car. You buy your electric car from China.
So here we have a jobs program, but it's not jobs for Americans, it's jobs for somebody else.
Money's all over the world. I don't even see how the economy works. I don't understand it.
Jim Hendrick gave a talk, and he had just left the United States Geological Survey. Laid back fella, and very laconically he's like, so these are the materials that we were very reliant on back in 1985. And now those are the ones we're reliant on today. And I was like, holy crap! Oh, I was like, are you kidding me? And he's, you know, and he was like, oh yeah, we're in a really bad way.
Something called rare earth materials. They're used by American manufacturers to make high-tech products like advanced batteries that power everything from hybrid cars to cell phones. We want our companies building those products right here in America. But to do that, American manufacturers need to have access to rare earth materials, which China supplies.
Our Congress has accepted that the rare earth issue is a national security issue. They recognize that it's an economic issue of massive proportions. So they get that. So what we also know is that thorium and rare earths are linked at the mineralogical level. And the U.S. will never be able to challenge China and build a value chain in rare earths until we solve the thorium problem.
Thorium's not dissolvable. You know, your body doesn't know what to do with it. It's not, you know, you can't, utilize it in your body at all. It won't build up in your system. It goes right through you. You'd be interested to visit the exposure lab at the University of Cincinnati. Workers like that worked on the Manhattan Project will their bodies to them, and they dissolve the bodies in HF and other acids, and then they sift it out and see how much plutonium and uranium and stuff wound up in their bodies. Yeah, it's sort of like donating your body to science. So they've got really, really good, very, very long-term exposure sites. If you got a nice career-long, 40-year, $10, $20 million a year cleanup contract that never ends, you're gonna, if you're, Fred's house of, radiation remediation, you're gonna be like, it's dangerous. So you got guys, that have a very vested interest in keeping this, as as scary as possible.
Monazite is a common waste product. Those aren't rare earth mining companies. Those are mining companies that exist today, right now, that are throwing away 5 times what the United States needs in rare earths every year. They're throwing away every single year 40% of global rare earth consumption demand every year because of the thorium. Every single year, we could meet almost 50% of the world's needs in rare earths just from taking their trash, going through their trash and pulling out the rare earths.
And if you're wondering, well, who could be against thorium? And who could be against rare earths?
They're so in love with this happy green idea and like, oh, we have the fluffiest bunny, we care the most. Well, it's not true. They're just silly.
So every time you walk through a door that goes psh, psh, it's either a carcinogenic door or a global warming door, which means your kids have no future. Being gay is good because that's good for overpopulation. When we've got too many people on the planet, the country can be totally converted to renewals within a year, if you've got the guts. How many use paper towels in the kitchen? Yeah, you're allowed to use paper to wipe your bottoms. That's all.
I like living the way I live, and I live fairly modestly. We live in a small house. I drive an 18-year-old Saturn. So we're fairly frugal, but I'm still an American, so that means I use vast amounts of resources no matter how frugal I am.
We've got to stop drilling for oil.
It just becomes more and more increasingly difficult to cut out the real big things, to be honest with you.
As you walk from room to room, turn off your lights.
It's easy to turn off the lights and to turn down the heat and don't use the air conditioning at all. But then you quickly run into the idea that, am I not going to fly to that conference? Am I going to ride a bike to, the grocery store?
We don't examine how we live. We don't examine how we eat. We don't examine that we don't walk upstairs, we go up in a thing. When you're in the plane, the hostess hands you a drink with a bloody bit of, tree beside it. I don't need that paper serviette.
Helen Caldicott is riding in an airplane, exposing herself to 10 times as much ionizing radiation from cosmic rays as she would experience at sea level. Her airplane is ejecting greenhouse gases directly into the stratosphere, and she's worried about a paper napkin.
We went out for buffalo wings, and I turned to her and I said, look, you're going to lead this movement, Bobby Wren. We went out for buffalo wings.
Helen Caldicott is eating buffalo wings. I eat meat too, but I recognize that a vegetarian diet emits a third less greenhouse gas into the atmosphere.
I don't know if you want to, hint at it, but we're talking about like domestic energy use, and you almost can't help it. We're so oblivious to it. So look at this room. It's how many lights do we have burning in here? 70, 80 lights to do this interview on how we should be better with energy usage. So we can't help but being hypocrites in the West almost. We're almost blind to the availability of energy to us. Just thought I'd say that.
Americans don't have any sense of scale as to what we actually need for our daily, to power Chicago, to power New York City, to power, Wind and solar are great ideas. It's just that the scale is completely off. And people, they're just missing it. They're just missing it, and it's very frustrating.
And you can't just say, well, I've got a full tummy and I'm busy and I can't do it. Every morning you get up and look in the mirror and say, what am I going to do today to save the planet? Don't do little things either. Do big things.
Let's do something big. Let's solve the most intractable problem ever to have faced humanity. One that even Helen Caldicott admits we are powerless in the face of. Our desperate need for toilet paper.
I wash it when I wash my underpants in the shower. Never use a tree to blow your nose. Don't use trees for anything except maybe when you go to the lavatory. You're allowed to use paper to wipe your bottoms. That's all.
As any carbon-emitting jet setter like Caldicott would know, there's a thing called a bidet. It shoots water upwards to clean your bottom. Preferably warm water. In a world of energy abundance made very possible by nuclear power, the bidet could replace toilet paper entirely. Yes, fancy ones even dry you with a blast of warm air.
It is so choice. If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up.
A world of sharply constrained energy supply.
We've got to stop. Do not, never use it. You don't need all this electrical gadgetry. Turn them all off.
Makes the bidet a less environmentally friendly proposition, because we'd also be constrained by limited fresh water and limited electricity to both warm the water and blow dry our bums. If we decouple energy production from pollution, and with nuclear energy we certainly can, then we can produce as much electricity as we want. Nuclear power can desalinate seawater, an infinite supply of fresh water for drinking, for farming, and for bidets. Nuclear power can produce carbon-free electricity. This allows us to heat the water and to sanitize the water once we've used it. And nuclear power provides carbon-free energy for the manufacture of bidets and the plumbing pipes themselves. Energy abundance gives us a bigger toolbox to address environmental concerns. When Caldicott talks about turning off lights and not using hand dryers, she's admitting we'll be trying to solve these environmental problems with less energy. She's admitting our toolbox will be smaller. Most of the solutions will involve changing human behavior rather than simply developing and deploying technology.
It's called global preventive medicine. The earth is the patient now, and we're all physicians to the patient.
What I practice is global preventive medicine.
We're here to serve. And we can save the world. We can save the world from global warming.
This mismatch between her stated goal of saving the planet and her actual impact of raising the cost of clean energy is due to her conflation of nuclear weapons with nuclear power.
Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You only need 10 pounds to make a nuclear weapon. So you get the plutonium, which is great because you can make bombs with it.
This is incorrect. Only select isotopes of plutonium can be used for weapons. For example, plutonium-238 was the very first isotope of plutonium discovered and cannot be used to make a bomb. We use it in radioisotope thermoelectric generators. Apollo astronauts used plutonium RTGs to power their science equipment. The Mars rover Curiosity is entirely powered by RTGs, enabling a wider array of power-hungry experiments and improved mobility than Spirit or Opportunity ever had.
The Mars exploration rovers often found themselves short on power as dust settled on their solar panels.
They were the only source of energy, and the Martian winter was approaching.
The part of it that really breaks my heart is that we just didn't have power to drive anymore.
In fact, any space probe sent beyond the asteroid belt has been powered by RTGs, because at that distance from the Sun, solar panels are useless. A well-powered Curiosity roaming Mars, and these spectacular images are all courtesy of plutonium-238. These are the plutonium isotopes found in spent fuel rods. There's plutonium-238. NASA has almost run out of 238. They'd love to get their hands on more 238.
I salute you.
But if you're Dr. Evil,
this organization will not tolerate failure.
You want plutonium-239. In fact, you need 90% of the plutonium to be 239, or else you can't make a bomb out of it. And you also need to keep plutonium-240 below 7%. 240 spontaneously fissions. That's a showstopper.
Sorry, I farted.
So are we choosing between space exploration and weapons here? No. Spent fuel from power reactors does not let us do either. We can't fuel space probes with it, we can't fuel Mars rovers with it, and we can't build bombs with it. The plutonium in so-called spent fuel is only useful as fuel in future reactors. That is its only use.
Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You only need 10 pounds to make a nuclear weapon. So you get the plutonium, which is great because you can make bombs with it.
A power reactor creates plutonium, which is not weapons grade. This number is 0. Isotopic separation is hard. This is basket weaving 101 of anti-proliferation. Isotopic separation of uranium is an expensive but developed technology. Isotopic separation of plutonium is not. Dig uranium up out of the ground, enrich it all to hell, and you've got weapons-grade material.
You know, I don't think we should be building nuclear weapons. In fact, I think nuclear weapons are terrible, but uranium's uranium. It's not exactly like we have a monopoly on the stuff. You know, it's a big planet, everybody's got some.
In contrast, a power reactor creates plutonium, which is not weapons grade. Distinguishing between the various isotopes is important.
On one side stays uranium-235, which is the one that is the fissionable one, and the other side, actually it's the reverse, stays U-238, which is non-fissionable, and this is 235.
See, Helen knows what an isotope is, so long as we're talking about uranium isotopes and how uranium isotopic enrichment adds to the cost of nuclear power. But plutonium isotopes?
They can make 50 bombs a year.
What's an isotope?
When Helen speaks, many people make contributions large and small to the organization.
The last 2 chapters of this book are very exciting because they give you the prescription for survival.
Oh, windmills. I don't like the look of those windmills. Too bloody bad. Better to have windmills than nuclear power plants, which are cancer factories. People waking up in the morning, their babies born deformed, like the babies at Chernobyl. Do you want to see the picture of the babies at Chernobyl?
Do you want me to hold your mic?
No. I'm on a roll. She said to me, "How much do you need?" And I went, $100,000. She said, "The cheque will be in the mail tomorrow." And it was. So we set up an office in K Street.
We have people who send in $15 a month, and then we've also had a number of individual donors who've made larger gifts, $5,000, $25,000, $100,000 to the Institute to support Helen and the work that she does of ending the nuclear age.
I took my own interest in Caldicott when she hosted a Google Hangout and fielded a question about thorium reactors, which are my own area of interest.
Why are we using uranium instead of thorium, which apparently is so much safer?
Well, that's a lie too.
I first heard about thorium as an energy resource in 2009 when I discovered 4 Google Tech Talks on the subject.
Dr. Joe Barametti.
I have a lot of material to go over.
Today's speaker is Robert Hargraves.
The probability of making plutonium in that kind of reactor is much, much less.
Our speaker today, Dr. David LeBlanc.
I have a lot to talk to you about today. I'm going to go fairly fast.
Today we have Kirk Sorensen.
The potential energy that's in thorium is really staggering.
Every single one made clear the practical way to convert thorium into energy was in liquid form, by dissolving the fuel in molten salt. There are no fuel rods involved at all.
In fluid form, you can get past a lot of the drawbacks of using thorium.
Any use in solid fuels, involves very difficult fuel processing.
First thing is that the fuel is in a liquid form. It means that the chemical processing is relatively easy to accomplish.
The expandability of the fluid gives you a large negative temperature coefficient, which is where your safety is at.
Melting the fuel rods down in concentrated nitric acid from the thorium reactor, extracting 233, and then making more fuel rods with that and putting it in another reactor. It's economically totally out of the question. Go to my webpage, section on thorium reactors written by physicists.
But every aspect of Helen's thorium commentary and the report she cites revolves around supposed use of solid fuel rods.
The title of the study was Thorium was no panacea for nuclear energy. Thorium in a solid-fueled reactor would do blah, 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 blah. And see, that's not very good, so thorium's dumb. Well, no, thorium's dumb in a solid-fueled reactor, not thorium's dumb.
Read about thorium reactors, which are ridiculously expensive and will never happen.
But if you're going to go out there and refute the use of thorium as an energy source, well, then it behooves you to do your homework.
And never say that again. And educate your friends and get the word out about thorium.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.
There are 17 different things a guy can do when he lies to give himself away. Guy's got 17 pantomimes. Woman's got 20. What we got here is a little game of show and tell. You don't want to show me nothing, but you tell me everything.
Doctors can't lie. We would be deregistered.
I would be deregistered.
If I lied about medicine, I would be deregistered.
Throughout the 1980s, Dr. Helen Caldicott didn't feel the need to assert her credibility. She has always been opposed to nuclear power, and she has always made incorrect statements on the subject.
Uranium enrichment alone in this country uses 3% of all the electricity generated.
But until 1989's fall of the Berlin Wall, it was not nuclear power which held her primary focus.
Russia's signed SALT II, America hasn't. Why not?
We had a revolution in the 80s and I led it. And I said we can get rid of nuclear weapons. So I recruited 23,000 doctors. And we started to say nuclear war is bad for your health.
Through the 90s, the threat of nuclear war diminished. Some weapons were taken apart and turned into fuel. In 2006, an inconvenient truth finally explained the chemistry and consequence of global warming to the movie-going public. Helen Caldicott would then focus on the two subjects capable of terrifying an audience: radiation from civilian nuclear power and global warming.
I've been saying for as long as I can remember that it will take a meltdown to end the whole nuclear madness. This will, I predict, end nuclear power. Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl. We are now in a situation where we have harnessed the energy of the sun. It is totally out of control, and there's simply nothing we can do about it.
When the nuclear disaster Caldicott had long predicted finally struck, and no one died from radiation, Caldicott's tone changed.
Well, they'll be dying of cancer, but they're not dying from lack of electricity. They might be sweating a bit in the summer. Oh, but you mustn't be too hot in the summer. That's what we've got sweat glands for.
There are 440 nuclear plants operating around the world. In the 50-year history of nuclear power, there have been 3 major accidents: 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. Only at one of those has there been a loss of life due to radiation.
These men are sociopaths. They've got no moral conscience. None.
The energy-related severe accident database, maintained in Switzerland, looks at every accident across the whole energy chain of different energy sources, and it gives a clear finding: nuclear is safer than coal, safer than oil, safer than gas, and safer than hydropower by a long margin.
These people should be tried like the Nazi war criminals were at Nuremberg. And I'm fed up with them.
He has opposed nuclear power in the past. George Monbiot says he now supports nuclear power.
No one has yet received what is believed by scientists to be a lethal dose of radiation.
After Fukushima, he's become pro-nuclear. He's either got a cerebral tumour or he's had a psychotic breakdown. That's my clinical diagnosis.
No one has yet received a lethal dose of radiation, and that has forced me really to challenge myself.
I used to be against nuclear power, kind of in a knee-jerk mode.
I needed to come back and look at an option that I hadn't permitted myself to see up to that point.
You and I are religious fanatics, or have been, about anti-nuclear. Nuclear is bad.
Improve technology. Don't say no nuclear power, say better nuclear power.
4 of the world's top environmentalists have written an open letter calling for more nuclear power. They say it's the only way to reverse climate change.
The climate scientists who wrote that letter, nobody is advocating building 1970s era nuclear reactors. We are excited about the next generation reactors that can be produced in factories, on assembly lines, all technology, an iPhone and wind turbines, solar panels. The cost comes down dramatically. The reason nuclear power is expensive right now is we haven't been building it.
Since the Industrial Revolution began, we have increased the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by 25%. The chairman of the International Energy Agency stood up and said, the way we're going, it's going to be 6 degrees centigrade hotter by the end of the century. And there's no evidence that anyone is doing a thing about it.
Why are we using uranium instead of thorium?
This is laws of physics stuff. I didn't invent it. Maybe I'll never see it happen in my life, but somebody will do it.
300 people working full-time on it. What keeps you from building one? Like, I want one to be built, and you're not building one.
Give us a little time.
Well, that's a lie too. It's economically totally out of the question. Educate your friends and get the word out about thorium.
The way we're going, it's going to be 6 degrees centigrade hotter. There's no evidence that anyone is doing a thing about it.
talking about the new generation of nuclear power.
With the AP1000 design, modular construction is a key asset with regard to the quality of the craftsmanship.
Before we know it, Unit 3 will be ready for the fuel load scheduled for 2017.
It's cheaper because it's got less steel and less concrete in it, and it's called an eggshell reactor in the industry, so it could easily have an accident. It's very dangerous. The way we're going, it's going to be 6 degrees centigrade hotter. There's no evidence that anyone is doing a thing about it.
GM's EV1 came out in 1996. The big oils heavily lobbying East Coast. Finally, GM called back all the EV1s from the market and crashed them in 2004.
Musk is an idealist who told us he had to start his companies so that man could colonize Mars and save the Earth. It's fast and smoke-free. The Tesla Model S is powered by 7,000 battery cells linked to an electric motor. No engine, no transmission, no tailpipe.
To change the end, rewrite the start. Electric car, so good so far.
Don't ever have an electric car that just plugs into the grid. That's a carcinogenic car. It's either coming from nuclear energy, which makes cancer, or it's a global warming car and it comes from the grid using coal.
What are you? Some kind of doomsday machine?
Why even make our children clean their teeth and have immunizations and have a good education when clearly they have no future, and they don't?
Helen's pessimism is self-fulfilling.
The biggest revelation, the personal revelation for me, was when I was ushered into that room in France where they have all the nuclear waste, and there's those tubes in the floor, and they're 1 meter wide and they're 10 meters deep. And it's vitrified glass inside a stainless steel tube.
In the 1980s, France drastically reduced their carbon emissions by turning to nuclear power. This is exactly the kind of rapid reduction that global warming demands.
All the long-lived waste that's left over from powering all of France for 30 years. Okay? And even then, I just couldn't get my head around it. And so I asked the guy, I said, how many of these tubes is what's left over from powering the entire city of, Greater Paris, which is like 10 million people, for 30 years? And he said 4 tubes. That's it.
Today, France's fleet of dated, water-cooled reactors provide 75% of their electricity needs. France's per capita carbon footprint is smaller than Germany's.
Like just a silver bullet, like, oh my God, what have I been thinking all this time? If you compare that to every time you drive past a coal plant or gas plant, you just see this gargantuan amount of just waste going into the atmosphere, all over the world 24 hours a day for decade after decade after decade.
France decarbonized safely with 1980s technology. We can decarbonize with modern, passively safe reactors.
The future of nuclear energy is going to not be these one-off plants. They're going to be manufacturing modular reactors on assembly lines, the same way we manufacture commercial jet aircraft. Standardized, heavy regulation. That's the future. We just got to go start doing it.
If we do, then energy will no longer be part of our global warming problem. Energy will be part of our global warming solution. We'll finally see what humans are capable of when we're no longer energy constrained.
Every time mankind has been able to access a new source of energy, it has led to profound societal implications. Human beings have had slaves for thousands and thousands of years. And when we learned how to make carbon our slave instead of other human beings, we started to learn how to be able to be civilized people. Thorium has 1,000,000 times the energy density of a carbon-hydrogen bond. What could that mean for human civilization going out thousands, tens of thousands of years into the future? Because we're not going to run out of this stuff. Once we've learned how to use it at this kind of efficiency, we will never run out. It is simply too common.